All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this afternoon's presentation. Today we're going to talk about a place that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I really like this city, and it's a place that I think we're all going to have a good time in, or at least those that are going to take the time to go there. This is the next to the last, the penultimate, I guess, presentation in my series that I'm doing on this leg of the cruise. And as you may or may not know, my name is Donald Campbell, and I'm the guest lecturer for destinations on this trip. Now, I said it yesterday, I'll say it again because I do know there are a few people who weren't here yesterday. I am not a native Italian speaker, and therefore I may mispronounce a few words or names or places, so please forgive me if that happens. But let's get on with it. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Of course, Shakespeare wrote that. The Romans didn't really say it. As they say, though, all roads lead to Rome, and that's where we're going to go. Now, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about our port, even though the port itself is a relatively important factor in Rome itself. The terminal at Civitavecchia is situated in what was the province of Rome on the Tyrrhenian Sea. The name Civitavecchia means ancient town. And the remains of Etruscan, Roman, and even some early medieval structures still remain in the town. At the beginning of the 2nd century, the Emperor Trajan built this city as the primary port for Rome. Now remember Trajan, because he's going to hop in and out a couple times later on. In the Middle Ages, Byzantine stronghold was established here in Civitavecchia, and then it was captured by the Saracens and subsequently acquired as a part of the Papal States. Arriving in port, you may see a Renaissance-era fortress. It's a relatively large structure. It's really hard to miss. It has 4 large corner towers. Fort Michelangelo was actually commissioned by Pope Julius II in 1503 to defend the port against pirates and other invaders. Now, he decided he needed to have somebody with a little artistic talent, and so he commissioned Michelangelo to design the tops of the 4 towers. Later on, he also commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel, as many of you know. Each of these bastions was named after a saint, and one of them, the tall one that's shown here in the front, actually has an underground passageway that was an escape route to get away from the fort. Originally, the fort was covered in travertine marble, and it was one of the largest that was ever built in that era. Now, you may also notice that the waters in Civitavecchia are very, very clear and clean. And the reason for that is there's a plant that's called the Poseidon bush that actually thrives at the tide line. When the tide is out, the bush really gets up and grows very rapidly, and it actually keeps the sediments and the debris from getting out into the water. Underneath the water, there are vast numbers of archaeological findings that are brought up all the time, and there are many, many more that still exist down there. Before we get into Rome's history, I think we have to get a little familiar with its geography, if you will. There are 7 hills. Not all of them are shown on this because some of them are further off to the right-hand side or to the east of this particular picture. And if you'll notice, the Vatican isn't here. The Vatican actually is up across the Tiber River to the northwest, or up to the upper left-hand corner of this particular slide. These original settlements that were made up early Rome, pre-Roman time, were actually on the tops of these little hills, because between the hills was all marshy swampland. Rome grew as the people became more and more connected with each other through commerce and through particular games that they played. Now, Capitoline Hill is a place where the current Capitol and City Hall are for the city of Rome. The black line that goes around that whole area is basically where Romulus built a wall to defend his early city. The Palatine Hill further down in the other red circle is actually the location of most of the archaeological finds, and it's a treasure trove for basically ancient Rome. The presentation is going to cover about 1,500 years, give or take, of the city's history, and I'm going to try to capture the essence of what was Rome. I'm not going to necessarily tell you where to go to eat, and I'm not going to tell you where to go to sleep or what to go see, although you're going to see a lot of what we're going to talk about. This is Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. The painting itself you may have seen by the time you get to Rome if you go to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Now, this wasn't painted until 1498, but it represents the period of Rome where in the kingdom where the gods themselves were kings, and the kings of Rome were gods. So it was kind of a juxtaposition for the two pieces. The kingdom itself began about 753 BCE, before the Common Era, and I'll use BCE and BC interchangeably if you don't mind. And it was characterized early on by a monarchical form of government. It included the city of Rome as we know it today and all of its extended territories. Paganism and mythology were very important in the kingdom. The notions that gods and goddesses came from the Greeks in southern Italy. At a time, Venus was a minor deity, and she was only important to the fields and gardens. The Romans identified Venus basically with the Greeks' Aphrodite and with the Babylonian Ishtar. Now, the Babylonians originally called what we know as the planet Venus Ishtar. Of course, the Romans and Greeks changed that to Venus later on. Now, the Romans usually treated all of these myths and historical incidents with supernatural powers. They really thought that these things were special. If you get the opportunity while you're in Rome to go to Trevi Fountain, it's really not an old fountain. It's a relatively new work, but it does have all of the ancient Greek gods portrayed in it, and that was because they were important to the Romans. During the Roman kingdom, the people believed that gods were everywhere. They were in trees, they were in bushes, they were in stones. They were throughout the houses. They were in the locks on the doors. They even resided in the furnaces or the cooking utensils on the stove. Each house had a little temple or a little shrine built into the kitchen. And when they ate their meals, they ate the meals in honor to the house god. About 700 BC, the Greek immigrants taught architecture to the Romans. And the Romans then started to build temples to the gods, and those were built all over Rome. Every day, people brought offerings to their temple, sometimes to more than one temple. And even today, people find a need to visit temples and fountains and to toss money. The Trevi Fountain now accepts all major credit cards. This work is titled Romulus and Remus, the Lupercanal, the Tiber, and the Palatine. Legendary twins Romulus and Remus are credited with founding Rome. And I say legendary because it's kind of hard to find any documentation covering it. The story goes that their mother was raped by the god of war Mars, and she bore twins. Well, her uncle, the twins' great uncle, actually decided that he wanted to take over as king. And so he usurped power of the tribe at that time, taking it away from the children, and he ordered that the children be thrown into the river and drowned. They were thrown into the river, but they were rescued by a she-wolf who raised them, suckled them until they could survive. Now, this kind of a story is a little hard to understand, but it's one that has existed in Rome for well over 2,500 years. A shepherd found the boys with the wolf in a cave at the Lupercal on Palatine Hill. And he took them home where they were raised by his wife. Now, her death is honored today in February by a fertility festival that's called Lupercalia. And it's kind of an interesting festival because on it, girls write little notes with their names on them and put them in urns, and the boys reach into the urn to pull out the name of the girl that will be their sexual partner for the next year. So I guess it's a novel twist on Valentine's Day. Now, whether they still celebrate that in Rome, I don't know, but it was celebrated there at beginning about 11 AD through the reign of Emperor Trajan. The Capitoline wolf is a 5th or 6th century bronze sculpture that depicts the legend of Romulus and Remus. and it's on display in the museum that's up on Capitoline Hill. According to legend, this wolf suckled the infants until they were found by that shepherd. Now, Romulus wanted, when he grew up, Romulus wanted to build his city on Palatine Hill. Remus preferred Aventine Hill. So the two boys were arguing about it, and the local priest, or augurs as they were called, told them to look to the sky for their answer. So the boys watched the sky for a while, and they were looking at flights of birds, because that's what augurs did. They were the first bird watchers. And they got the idea of what should happen. Now, one of the birds that they saw was a lammergeier. It's a bird that's now being reintroduced into Italy because it almost went extinct back in 1913. They've been doing a big program to bring it back. Romulus saw more birds than Remus did, and so the augurs said that Romulus won the contest. Remus didn't agree, and an argument broke out between them, and Romulus killed Remus basically on Aventine Hill, and he went on to found the city of Rome. And he founded it on Palatine Hill, but as he was doing so, he went down below the hill and he dug a trench all the way around all of the city that was to become Rome. And Remus's tomb was put up on top of Aventine Hill. Commerce was controlled throughout the area by Rome because even though roads were very, very rudimentary and simplistic at the time, commerce still was there between all the tribes. And Rome sat right in the middle of this commerce and controlled the roads in all the different directions. Romulus's fortress was built on the top of Capitoline Hill as a barrier to his enemies, namely the Sabine. And legend may have some basis in fact because they have found remnants of an old fortification that dates to about the 8th century BCE. So there may be some fact that's associated with the legend of Romulus and Remus. Tarpeian Rock, which actually is infamous in a lot of ways because it was used as a place of execution for traitors and criminals. Roman punishment for treason was to be thrown from the top of this rock. And another legend says that one of the Vestal virgins who had come from Sabine background opened the city gates to the Sabines so they could attack the Romans. The Sabines, though, weren't really very helpful to her. They took her and crushed her with their shields and then threw her off of this cliff. She was then buried up on top of the cliff, and as she believed that she would get a golden bracelet, instead she got a shield. The Sabine of Rome lived on Capitoline Hill, and Romulus needed women to help populate the city. He asked for marriage contracts from his neighbors, and they all said no. So what Romulus did is he invited all of his neighbors to a weekend of games, different kind of sporting events, and for a kind of a carnival. And while they were there, his men captured and kidnapped primarily Sabine girls as brides. And of course, the Sabine didn't take very lightly with this. And this painting, The Intervention of the Sabine Women, was done in 1799 by the French painter Jacques-Louis David. It depicts Romulus's wife in the center. She was the daughter of Titus, who was the ruler of the Sabine. She was also the wife of Romulus, the Roman. She's rushing between her husband and her father, and she put her children on the ground between the two of them. Why did she do that? To try to stop the fight between the Romans and the Sabine men. A vigorous Romulus is prepared to strike her father with his sword. The fathers and husbands were both at great risk of dying in this battle. The women did not want to be widowed and orphaned on the same day, and they cried out, allegedly, quote, "It will be better for us to perish here than to live lacking either of you." They loosened their hair and tore their garments as a sign of mourning. "If," they cried, "you are weary of these ties of kindred, these marriage bonds, then turn your anger upon us. It is we who are the cause of the war. It is we who have wounded and slain our husbands and fathers." Both sides heard their pleas, and the leaders came forward to make a truce. For a time, Romulus continued to rule, but he ultimately, because he had a Sabine bride, he took the Sabine in as allies. That was the legend of the rape of the Sabine women. However, Livy, who was a Roman historian and actually in the time itself, said clearly that no sexual assault really took place. He wrote a monumental piece of work sometime around 10 BC, and according to him, Romulus really went to the women and offered them the full rights of citizenship in Rome, promised them civic and property rights, the same rights as the Roman men would have. He spoke to each of those women in person, pointed out that the war was due to the pride of the elders who didn't want to see intermarriage of their children, the young men of Rome and the young women of the Sabine. He said that by marrying his men, they would live in honorable wedlock and the mothers would be free. Beside the Sabine, other city-states ultimately feared Rome's growing power and they declared war. It wasn't necessarily the best thing to do, but the Etruscans found it necessary to attack Rome. They were up in northern Italy, as shown in the dark red area here on this map. They wanted to suppress Rome as a future threat, so they attacked. They didn't understand how strong Rome was, and Romulus and his troops drove the Etruscans back into their city. They were unable to get their gates closed in time, and the Romans overwhelmed the city and destroyed it. The Etruscans, though, did give some things to the Romans that were pretty important. They gave them writing, they gave them a form of dress, tools. All of those had been adopted from Greeks, and all of it was ultimately passed on to the Romans. Soon, even though the Etruscans had been enemies, the Etruscans had enough power and influence that they began to rule Rome. Religious practices and shoes actually looked like they had just come from Turkey. They introduced urban planning that was on a rectangular basis, with streets laid out in blocks rather than just wandering. They built roads, bridges, sewers, and actually drained the marshes. Public buildings were built and constructed with arches and vaults. They promoted trade, developed metallurgy, and most of all, they improved the agriculture of the area. The Etruscans, like the Romans, were very suspicious. It was part of their relationship between God and man, and they believed in multiple deities. Everything was a manifestation of the divine. The world was full of unexplained things. Darkness and fear was rampant. They developed the reading of omens in their worship, and they were one of the societies that used to look at the innards and the entrails of animals that were slaughtered and sacrificed and used that as a way to determine what the future was to hold. They believed that ghosts would actually come into the home of the dead and that the ghost would bite the nose off of the dead person. So they would stay up all night guarding this body until it could be buried. They believed in witches and vampires, and they believed that old women could turn into ravens and fly off. There are very few Etruscan structures that are still left, and these are actually near Rome. They're Etruscan tombs, and they're a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Etruscans used a thing called a shippy, which was basically a phallic symbol to say that a tomb was that of a man. And then they had a little house as a symbol that was on a tomb of a woman. Now, most of what was excavated from this area can still be found both in the Etruscan and the Vatican museums in Rome. The origin of the Forum is linked to the alliance between Romulus and his former Sabine rival and father-in-law Titus. When Romulus died, Pompilius was chosen to lead Rome. Pompilius was another Sabine, and he was another one of Titus's son-in-laws. During his reign, he built the Temple of Vestal Virgins and the Temple of Vesta. It was outside the walls of the Sabine fortress and was dedicated to Vulcan, the god of fire. The Vestal Virgins, as some of you may know, had a primary duty, and that was to keep the sacred fires burning in the temple. She was the goddess of the hearth. Her temple's most recognizable feature, if you think about this room being a full circle rather than two-thirds of a circle, it was basically they were all circular. They were round, and the entrances always faced east, and that was the link between the fire and the hearth and the sun rising in the east. That was the link between them and the god. It was a Greek-style temple with Corinthian columns, and had a central place for the always burning fire. The roof had a hole in it to allow the smoke and soot to get out, and there were 20 columns that surrounded that podium. The podium itself was about 20 feet in diameter, so a little bigger than this room. The house of the Vestal Virgins was right behind the temple on the eastern edge of the forum. Now, 6 Vestal Virgins lived here in a 50-room complex, so they had a pretty good deal. The young women were chosen from patrician families. Their primary duties, as I said, was to keep the fires burning. If they let the fire go out, they were severely beaten. Other duties were performing rituals and preparing salt cakes that were used in ceremonies. Now, if a virgin broke her vow of chastity, this was a bad, bad thing to do. So if you have granddaughters or daughters, you might tell them you don't want to be a Vestal Virgin necessarily. If they lost their virginity, they were entombed alive beneath the temple. Now, at one point in time, there was some bad event that happened in Rome. It's not really documented what went wrong, but a committee of Roman leaders was pulled together to study this event, to investigate it, and what they determined was that the event happened because all of the Vestal Virgins did not live up to their vows. So all of the virgins were executed by being buried alive. Now, I guess they may have just as well broken their vow of chastity. In 210 BC, a bunch of slaves, 13 of them, saved the temple from a fire and were all given their freedom. The temple was destroyed several times by fire and rebuilt, including the last time by Trajan. And then 100 years later, a Vestal Virgin was struck by lightning, and when that happened, it struck fear in the Romans because they just couldn't understand how God could kill one of their religious people. The Temple of Jupiter was soon dedicated on Capitoline Hill. Now, when they were going to build Jupiter's temple, there were a lot of people that were living up there, and they had to get rid of these people. There was also a temple up there that was a temple to a god named Terminus, who was the god of the edge of things. Terminus's people refused to move his temple, and the augurs saw that as a symbol or an indication that Rome would last forever. Rome would not be moved. And they decided to make Terminus's temple part of the temple to Jupiter. The augurs saw this, and they really believed this was the right thing to do. And then builders, as they were digging the foundation of the new temple, found a rock with the visage of a human face on it, and that was proof to them that Rome would endure and become a great empire. Now, I guess those are the same kind of people that looked at birds to tell the future, so I don't know how good that was. Cloaca Maxima is one of the few places where you can actually see something from the early kingdom of Rome. And it's actually a door that's near the forum that's down like this that I guess you get special permission, you can go through it. Basically, it goes into an ancient sewer. Tarquin the Elder was the 5th king of Rome, and he ruled from about 579 BCE. What he did is he went in and he drained the swamps and he put in a series of sewers. Then the sewers were big enough for boats and men to actually go through to keep the thing clean, but primarily it was for draining water and sewage out of the city. After the expulsion of Lucius and the Etruscans, the monarchy then became a republic. They decided they didn't want kings anymore. They were going to elect their leaders. So about 500 BC, the era of the kingdom of Rome was over. The Roman Republic had begun with the overthrow of a monarchy. Now, during the first 2 centuries, the Romans, boy, it's pretty fuzzy. The Roman Republic expanded throughout conquest and alliance. It ruled the entire Italian peninsula, and it began conquering lands to the south, to the west, to the east, to the north. They included North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula that we know as Spain and Portugal, Greece, and what is now southern France. But uneasy alliances across all of this really caused a series of civil wars. About 50 years after the Republic was formed, a constitution was established, and it was centered on the principles of the separation of powers with checks and balances between the different parts of their government. It was heavily influenced by the struggle between the patricians, the rich, wealthy people, and the citizen commoners or the plebeians. At first, power was in the hands of the patricians or the upper class. They made up the hereditary nobility from the kingdom era, and the assembly consisted of all of the plebeian citizens of Rome. And over time, laws were repealed and weakened. Then they decided they had to make more firm laws. Laws were then known as the 12 tables because they were organized into 12 panels or sections. They were carved into stone. And the laws covered things like property and crime and family and marriage and inheritance and all those sort of things. Everything that we consider a part of our law today. There were laws to control spending by the government. I don't know if the government really paid attention to it, but those laws were there. Their main benefit was that the law was set in stone, and because it was set in stone, they could not be changed. At least that's what they believed. They were displayed all around the forum so that everyone could see them and could not say they didn't know the law. 100 senators from noble and wealthy families served for life. They elected 2 consuls from the Senate that served a year in the highest positions of power. Consuls could name a new senator if one died. Except in times of national emergency, the consuls were limited to 1 year. Of course, as many people know, there were times when emergency after emergency after emergency occurred, so a consul could stay in power for a relatively long period of time. But each of the consuls, each one, was given veto right over the power of the other, so it had a tendency to keep things under control. But the 2 consuls actually led the army. Now, people, when they go through Rome, they see SPQR. It's Latin. I'm not even going to try to tell you what it means. I'll give you the translation. It's for the Senate and people of Rome. The new Roman government decided that they would put this on every building, every structure, everything that was part of their government. And it was an indication to the people of Rome that things had changed. It was no longer a kingdom. It was a thing that they now controlled. The Senate expanded open areas by buying homes and removing them. The king was gone. The republic built temples and aqueducts and roads. They were great orators. These people loved to talk. They loved to debate. They flocked to the forum to hear people. They stopped, they listened, then they would wander away to go shopping. It's kind of like going to the mall in the modern world, right? Only you don't necessarily hear too many orators. A lot of times they would go to more than one temple. The forum was a huge complex of temples, basilicas, and arches. It was a ceremonial, legal, and social and business center for all of Rome. Courts were in session at the forum, and orators met and argued. Political speeches, civil trials, and public affairs took up more and more space, and they had to continually enlarge the forum. Finally, they had areas within the forum where specialty topics could be discussed rather than have this rabble all over town. And so they had a section that might be just for talking about food, kind of like the Food Network. And then you had another section where they would talk about religion. And then they had another section which was politics. The Temple of Venus in Roma at the Forum was the largest in ancient Rome. It had 2 main chambers. One was for the cult Venus, the other for the cult Roma. Now, in Roman terms, Venus was Amor, and Rome was Roma. And the 2 cults faced each other. And if you think about it, Roma is the reverse of Amor. I don't know if they understood it at that time, but I think they did. Now, the short side of the temple only had 10 columns, and the long sides had about 18 columns. They were 6 feet in diameter, and they were huge. Most of the columns, just like a lot of the other works in Rome, were taken away for construction of other buildings. But there are only a few of these columns still left at this temple site. One home to Circus Maximus, once home to Circus Maximus. This is a park now. It's a large park in Rome, and you can still see the outline of the original racetrack that was there. It was a stadium entertainment site for processions and gladiatorial contests. It was about 2,000 feet long and almost 400 feet wide. It could accommodate 150,000 spectators. And those spectators came to watch gladiatorial contests, 4-horse chariot races, staged hunts, and so on. It was the first and largest stadium of its kind. The races were wildly popular, and the gates to circus were created about 329 BC. And then ultimately they put these wooden markers up on the top that would be pulled down as each lap in a race was completed. Now this model shows what Circus Maximus looked like in its day. The people supported teams that represented summer, winter, spring, autumn. It was easier than trying to give them names like Red Sox and Giants and things like that. Now Ludi was the name that they had for game days. And those were public holidays where no business was to be done in Rome. Now they had 135 Ludi days a year. And when you think about it, that seems like an awful lot of time off. But if you take the modern world where, say you work a 40-hour, 5-day work week, so you get 2 days off each week, some weeks you get 3 days off because you have a special holiday. Almost everybody takes a 2-week vacation. So when you add all of those things up, it comes out pretty close to 135 days for most people. Now the Christian leaders didn't like Ludi, and they told their followers not to participate because Ludi also was tied to pagan gods. Now the games gradually fell out of power, and the last race was held here in about 549 AD, almost 1,000 years after the first race. Most of the original building material from it was used for construction, as were a lot of the sites in Rome during the Renaissance. Via Appia was a major road in Rome in the 3rd century BC, and it's called also the Appian Way. It spanned 330 miles from Rome to the Adriatic coast. Actually, it also was extended to the west over to the Mediterranean. Christian tradition says that this is where Jesus appeared to St. Peter, and Peter and Paul were once believed to have been buried here. More and more Christians wanted to be buried near them, and an underground cemetery grew to be miles and miles of underground burial sites. The Romans actually had a 50,000-mile network of roads that crisscrossed all of the empire, and these were used to spread the legions, for trade, for culture, and for influence. And as I said earlier on, all roads led to Rome. Gaius Julius, who some of you may have heard of, was a Roman general and a distinguished writer of prose. His attempts at power were opposed by the conservative elite within the Senate. Later, known as Julius Caesar, he conquered Gaul by 51 BC, and his invasion of Brittany extended Rome's territory to the English Channel and to the Rhine. The Senate ordered Caesar to lay down his arms and return to Rome as a citizen. He refused, and when he brought his legion across the Rubicon, the Senate decided that he should become their new leader. Venus Genetrix was goddess of motherhood and domesticity. She was a favored god by Caesar. He really thought a lot of her. Her temple was built by him at the Forum. The facade is on a small podium, and it was reached by 2 staircases that went up from one side to the other. And inside, Caesar put figures of Venus, a statue of himself, of course. You had to have a statue of yourself if you built something like this. Cleopatra, a statue. He didn't put Cleopatra there. Greek paintings, some engraved gems, and a breastplate from Britannia. There were 8 marble columns, and the temple was destroyed in 80 AD by a fire. Today, only 3 ornate columns are the last remaining evidence that that temple was ever there. After assuming control of the government, Caesar began a program of social and government reform that didn't necessarily go over well with the people in the Senate. And he created the Julian calendar that we use today. He centralized bureaucracy of the Republic, but that era was soon coming to an end. The 500-year-old dynasty, if you will, had been weakened by his appointment as a perpetual dictator. Underlying conflicts had not been resolved, and on the Ides of March in 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators led by Brutus. Temple of Caesar was built by Augustus after the Senate deified Caesar. Now you have to understand, Caesar had kind of good followers and bad followers. His good followers decided that Caesar's corpse needed to be deified, needed to be treated as a god. He was carried to the Forum on an ivory couch, and placed up on a pedestal for his funeral pyre. They took all the wood furnishings out of the forum and piled them around the pyre and started a blaze that lasted throughout the night. There was a public reading of his will so that all of the people of Rome would know what he had to say. They also had a figurine of Caesar that was above the bier that actually rotated, and as it rotated, it showed all the wounds on Caesar's head and body that had come from his assassination. Consecration of his temple lasted for several days, and they had gladiatorial games and hunting and banquets and all that kind of stuff. And they even brought hippopotamus and rhinoceros into Rome to be seen there for the very first time. Brutus spoke first at the funeral and explained why he killed Caesar. Not that I love Caesar less, but I love Rome more. Mark Antony was next, who said, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives with them. The good is often interred with their bones, so let it be with Caesar." Now this, you can see, it got a little bit more crowded, a little bigger. The Roman Empire in 1117 AD. The final blow to the Republic was a civil war, including the Battle of Actium. Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus, led the fight. It was a naval engagement fought between Octavian and the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. You remember her. She was, well, anyway. Mark Antony had abandoned his wife, Octavian's sister. He moved to Egypt and started a long-term affair with Cleopatra. He was seen as a leader of a separatist movement that threatened to break up the Roman Republic. Octavian's victory enabled him to consolidate his power over Rome, and Egypt was added as a new territory. Historians generally view that as the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the empire. Octavian was named emperor for life and given the title Augustus. His official name was Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus because he had been adopted earlier on by Caesar. He never liked being called emperor during his lifetime. He preferred to be called Princeps Civitas, or first citizen. He had an autocratic power as a military dictator with powers granted to him for life by the Senate. Triumphal arches were one of the things that he and others built, such as the Arch of Titus that's shown here. These inspired many post-Roman rulers. The Arch of Titus sits on the southeast side of the Forum. It was constructed by Domitian shortly after the death of his older brother, Titus. The Romans used these things to announce laws and to commemorate victories. They were used to celebrate new colonies, construction of roads, all that kind of stuff. Augustus Caesar was the emperor for 41 years, and he decreed that only emperors could call for the construction of an arch. And these have become the general model of great triumphal arches around the world. The most notable that people think of is the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Augustus completed Caesar's work on the Forum, and he said, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble." Before 14 AD, Rome's population reached over 1 million people. To accommodate the masses descending on the city for work and business opportunities, architects designed blocks of housing flats. We think of them today as apartments or even tenements. The flats accommodated many families in the same building, and some held up to 200 people. Most were 3 or 4 stories, and actually the builders decided they could go up to as far as 9 stories. But they were hazardous because they were flammable, and Augustus said that they were unsafe. So he limited the height to 70 feet, and that worked out to be about 7 stories. In an uninhabited area on the opposite side of the Tiber River from Rome, Agrippina the Elder built gardens early in the 1st century, and they later became the site of the Vatican. Legend has it that a crude oil spring was bubbling up over here, and local Jewish community leaders interpreted that as a sign of God's grace would flow into the world. I don't know how bubbling oil and God's grace came together, but that's what they believed. Later, because of this interpretation, the location became a meeting spot for the first Roman converts to Christianity. Caligula constructed a circus here along with a house for his mother. He brought the obelisk from Egypt to decorate his circus, and that's one of the things that is still evident today. It sits right in the middle of the plaza at St. Peter's. Circus was actually completed by Nero, and it was called the Circus of Nero. Really, it was a horse track, and the area was a site of martyrdom for many Christians after the Great Fire in 64 AD. Tradition says that it was in this area that St. Peter was crucified upside down during Nero's reign. In AD 69, Gaul and German armies arrived in Rome, and many of them camped out up on top of that hill in what was considered an unhealthy district. They died by the thousands. It was due to the inability of the troops to bear heat, and when it got really hot, they would drink water from contaminated streams that were up on that hill. By the 2nd century, the size of the Vatican district as we know it today corresponded roughly to the present-day Vatican City. In the first half of the 4th century, funeral monuments, mausoleums, and small tombs were built on the site, and ultimately Constantine I decided to honor St. Peter with a large basilica built around 324. It was after he recognized Christianity as his religion and a religion for Rome. Slopes of the Vatican actually were excavated to make them level rather than to build on nearby flat land that was only slightly to the south. Nero's circus was falling into ruin because many of its stones were used to build a new church. The church had a nave and 4 aisles, a transept and an apse, and at the center was Peter's tomb. Stairs and a 4-sided portico for the non-baptized completed the building. St. Peter's Basilica became a new attraction for tourists in Rome. This is the old basilica, not the new one. Vatican Hill grew by dwelling houses connected to the activity at St. Peter's, and these places became part of the palace that was built on the side of the basilica in the 5th century. That palace was the original Vatican apartments. It was used for visiting dignitaries and royalty from around the world. The Santa Rosa necropolis near the Vatican Museum was covered during the construction of the basilica, the original basilica. It was unearthed in 2003 during construction of a parking lot. They found gardens belonging to Agrippina and proof that Caligula and Constantine were involved in the early site. There were also mansions in the area. The necropolis was a burial place for both upper class and for artisans. And the artisans' tombs were decorated with things that showed what their specialty was, what their art was. In fact, archaeologists have said this was actually a little Pompeii of some cemeteries because it had so much information in it. There were simple terracotta funeral urns with ashes still inside and ornately sculptured sarcophagi. They dated back to Augusta and Constantine, and also were the burial place for Nero's private property archivist and for mailmen. Yep, mailmen. The mail has to go through. The area around the present location of the Colosseum was very densely populated, and it was devastated by the Great Fire of 64 AD. Nero decided this was an opportunity for his own purposes, and he seized the area for his personal property, built a huge palace there with a pool and a lake and porticos and gardens, and of course another huge statue of himself. Colosseum came along about 16 years later, and it was built by Vespasian, who demolished Nero's palace. So nothing remains to speak of Nero's palace. It was the largest structure in the empire and a great work of Roman engineering. It was built for games and entertainment. The Venetatio was a show that hunted wild animals. Exotic beasts were brought to Rome, and hunts were held in the morning when it was cooler and the animals were more active. And then after that, flutists and dancers and artists would perform over the lunch hour, and then after lunch they would have gladiatorial contests. One hunt included leopards, bears, lions, elephants. One of these hunts was so extensive that it may have driven some animals to extinction. The building conveyed the glory of Rome, and when you see it today, it still gives that message. Vespasian's oldest son, Titus, completed the arena and actually held its first games. His brother Domitian added the top tier, as well as a network of underground tunnels, rooms, and cells that were used for the gladiators and the animals beneath the center floor. Now, nobody knows how much this place cost, but they do know that all of the treasures that were seized in the sack of Jerusalem by the Roman army were applied to it. And 100,000 Jewish prisoners were brought from Jerusalem to do the construction. Now, this building was actually influenced by two great Roman inventions that we still use today: concrete and vaulted arches. Colosseum is an oval structure. It's over 650 feet long and 510 feet wide. It's 187 feet high and covers about 6 acres. Crowd control was a big problem because this thing would hold 50,000 people, and it didn't have elevators and escalators, so it had to be designed with enough access and egress so that they could completely empty this place in just a matter of minutes, 10 minutes or less. They used a new technique called standard parts. Stairs and seats were fabricated off-site and brought to the construction site, and all the stairs and seats were the same size and shape, so they could be easily replaced and were interchangeable. Travertine marble was quarried 20 miles away from Rome and was used for the main pillars, the ground floor, and all the walls. Colosseum represented everything that was imperial to Rome, and it still is important today. Gladiators fought to the death for the amusement of the mobs, as the Roman people were called. Thousands of prisoners of war and victims of religious persecution were fed to the lions and tigers, and even those animals were ultimately killed. The Colosseum consumed tens of thousands of animals over its life, but the last known beast hunt actually took place only in 523 AD. It was no longer used for entertainment by the 13th century, and after that, it was used for housing, it was used as a convent, it was used for workshops, it was used as a fortress, it was used as a Christian shrine. It became a church or a temple. As with many other sites, the rocks were taken away. It was used for construction. Today, it's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There are over 40 of these sites in Italy, more than any other country in the world. Trajan was a Roman emperor from 98 to 117 AD. And this statue is at the Roman Wall in London. He was born a non-patrician and rose to prominence during the reign of Augustus. Trajan was known chiefly for a reign of terror and extensive public building programs that reshaped Rome. He left numerous landmarks such as Trajan's Market and Column. He honored Caesar and the cult by rebuilding the Temple of Venus and Genetrix in 113 AD. Another artifact of the Roman Empire are the Jewish catacombs at Vigna Radina. They're found during work on Mussolini's stables, and they were uncovered. They found that they were all underground in a soft lava rock. They're a labyrinth of tunnels and burial chambers that cover about 140,000 square feet. Now, the volcanic rock was actually pretty easy to cut into as long as it didn't get air on it. Once it was exposed to air for a little bit of time, it started to get really hard. So it made an ideal way to dig these tunnels, get the burials in there, and then seal them back up. There's beautiful drawings and frescoes on the walls that show classic Jewish symbols in this particular set of catacombs. There's a 7-branch menorah, an ark with the law tablets, circumcision knife, and much more. Now, they're closed to the public and may only be visited by special permission, but there are catacombs that are open to the public, and those are the Christian catacombs that followed the Jewish by about 100 years. Bodies were buried fully clothed, wrapped in linen, and sprinkled with ointments and lotions to offset the smell of decay. Each niche was sealed with a slab and inscribed with the name and date of death and religious symbols of the person that was buried. Today, the Vatican maintains the catacombs of St. Calixtus on the outskirts of Rome. They're actually on the Appian Way and are notable for the tombs of several 2nd and 4th century popes. At the peak, the site may have had as many as 16 popes and 40 martyrs buried in it. They're the oldest underground burial network, and they're the only ones that still have bones. The Pantheon is the best preserved building of ancient Rome and was dedicated to all the pagan gods. The name Pantheon comes from the fact that statues were placed all around it, and also there is the roof that resembles the dome of heaven. In mythology, it stood where Romulus was carried away by an eagle after he was slain. Here the people worshiped the 7 gods of Rome: Sun, Moon, Venus, Saturn, Jupiter, Mercury, and Mars. The concept was very revolutionary because all the people could go into this temple rather than have it only kept there for the priests and the virgins. Pantheon was burned down in 80 AD, was rebuilt and then struck by lightning and rebuilt again. The Byzantine emperor gave it to Pope Boniface the VIII in 608, and it's been used since that time as a Christian church. Now, the Pantheon is a circular building with a portico of large Corinthian columns. It's really one of the true works of art from ancient Rome that is still intact. It has a rectangular vestibule that links the porch to the rotunda, the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. It's huge. It's 142 feet across and 142 feet high. At the top is the oculus, which is that open hole, and it's open to the sky, and it's the only source of light inside the building. Now, to support the weight of this huge concrete mass, the walls at the base are over 20 feet thick, and it gets thinner and thinner and thinner as it goes up, so that at the very top, by the oculus, it's only 7 feet thick. At the top also, the concrete was made using pumice, which is a light volcanic rock, rather than the gravel that was used at the bottom, which was primarily granite. The Romans used a different type of concrete throughout this building, and it was the first time that they showed that they had the ability to do that. And along with the coffers in that particular dome structure, this thing has withstood earthquakes and mankind for nearly 2,000 years. It's an amazing structure. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this early history of early Rome. It's just to give you a context so that when you go to Rome, you can get a better feeling for what the city is all about. Now, remember, this started in the 8th century BC and went through about the 6th century AD. So we're talking about a long period of time that was covered by a very, very influential group of people. Rome itself lasted for thousands of years in history and in antiquity. They had influence on the rest of the world, on all of our lives and all of our politics. And I want you to enjoy your visit there and keep your eyes open for other signs of ancient Rome that I haven't discussed today. And of course, be sure to watch for my future presentation. There's one tomorrow at 5:30 in here. It'll also be on the stateroom television, and it's in the evening passages to make sure that it's a reminder for you. So watch your television. This will be on tonight on Channel 8. I believe it's Channel 8, yep. And remember, I'm Donald Campbell. I'm your destination speaker for this voyage. Thank you very much. If you have questions, I'll meet you out in the atrium.